So our last recording with the React router, it was hard to see and whatnot. So we're going to do another recording with React router, but it's actually fairly timely because they've made some significant changes in the 1.0 release. So if you are using the React router, the 0.13 version or previous, there are a few breaking changes you'll want to be aware of. And so we'll walk through some of those changes and look at how you implement routing with the 1.0 version, which I think is currently a release candidate, but should be made available fairly soon, I believe. Okay, so they have an upgrade guide on their website, which walks through some of these changes. I'm going to briefly go through these, and then we'll actually look at some code. So one of the things that changes is that you're going to import, the React router, and you can import router and route from that router. We usually do it this way. So we import router and route from React router. All right. Rendering, getting the router to actually work is now different. You used to do router.run, and you would give it routes, and then render some kind of a handler. Now you just call render, just almost like it's just another React component. And I guess that's the intent of the authors, is to make it look as much like any React component as possible. So we do that. Let's see, we've got setting up this browser history. So they have created another library called history that you'll want to add to your project. And you use that new library like this, where you create browser history, and you create this history object, you can give that to the router. That's what allows you to do transitions, which we'll show here in just a minute. A couple other things you'll notice have changed. There's no longer any named routes. So you used to be able to say route name is this, and here is the handler, and you would give the handler a React component. The word handler is basically changed to component, so you can just change those straight across. So component is whatever it is you want to have rendered, but you do give it a path, which is different now. It doesn't look different in this example, but you'll see how it's different here when we look at the conversion of transition to into the new methods that we've started using. There's no not found route anymore. You use a star. We have these redirect routes. Links make some minor changes. Figuring out which route is currently active has changed slightly as well. So all of that is actually available in the API documentation and is going to be particular to the app that you're creating. So some of this might not affect you if you have really simple routing. If you have more complex routing, like we do in some of our applications, the changes will be a little bit more significant. The other thing that's gone here is the route handler. So instead of having route handler, you just do this.props.children, which again looks just like all the other React components. Because if you wanted to render a child component, you would call this.props.children and render. Okay, so let's take a look at some actual code. So here is the routes file from our old application. You can see we import React, we import React router, and then we import these various components. Now, you assign, this is how we had our project set up anyway. Route is router.route, and there was a not found route, and there was a default route, and there was a redirect, which wasn't even used in this file. And then looking at this code, you can see we've specified a route path, we've given it a name, and a handler with the index component. So that says as soon as you hit the route path of this particular application, then you're going to render the index. All right, so that would give us kind of the Chrome of the application, but would leave the main content area empty, which is problematic, so we added a default route. And the default route has this home component. So if you hit the route path and nothing else matches, then render the home component. And then we've got this not found, so if we end up in a situation where in this example in particular, if it was any path, like if I put foobar on the URL, then I would hit the not found component. In the new router, there's just a couple of changes when setting up your routes file. You can see that there's no name on the route. It's just a path, which is the root. Again, we changed handler to component, so now that's index. The component's index. Index route is essentially replacing default route here. So if we hit the index route, meaning the root without anything else tacked onto it, we will render the home component. There's no not found route available anymore, so you can just say for any path that matches. So if we fall into this case, then we're going to render the not found. So basically, functionally it's the same. They've just changed the semantics a little bit right here. Okay, so any questions about that particular piece? Just building the routes.
Are routes now regexes?
I believe that it has some kind of regex matching functionality. If you go dig into the docs, it talks about how they match the routes. But I actually think that the way that they're matching it is not all that different than it was before. Let's see. I ran across this when I was reading. It's somewhere in the API docs, I believe. Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll link to the docs and you can take a look at it. Let's see. Does all of its path matching asynchronously. Oh, this is one of the new benefits is you can lazily load your route configurations. So you can, I believe, request components on demand. So you don't have to load the entire file into the client to be able to get all of the functionality. So that way you don't have to have like a 10 megabyte download just to run your application. You can start out with some basic initialization code and then download different pieces of your app as you need. And again, if you use Webpack, then that makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Let's see. This doesn't really answer the regex question. Yeah, internally, I'm not entirely sure. I'm guessing it's probably a regular expression. I haven't read through the code lately, so I don't know. But. Okay, so let's take a look at some other changes here in app.jsx. So this is the code from the old application before we made the changes. You can see that you only need to import React and the router and then the routes that we just looked at. And then you just do router.run, give it, well, it gives you this handler, and then you call react.render with the handler, and you give it the element in the page that you wish to render into. All right, so that has changed significantly in the new router. Now we have React DOM. So, well, that's actually a change with React, not with React Router, but when you upgrade the router, you'll want to use React 14, and in React 14, they've separated the DOM piece from React so that you can actually swap that out, because what they found is people were rendering with different types of outputs. So I could render into the canvas element, and I might have a different rendering engine for that. The DOM renders in the HTML DOM. I think Netflix has their own custom framework that handles rendering to televisions and whatnot. So you can render a lot of different ways, and that's why I think they've separated that out. So now you have to include React DOM as well as React. So when you want to call the render method right here, you call that on React DOM rather than on React. Okay, so we've also imported our routes, and then, you know, again, before we did this React.render handler thing. Now what we do is React DOM.render. Router acts just like any other React component. Its child is your routes that you've created, and one of the attributes is this history object. So we'll go look at the history object here in 1 second. This part has not changed. You still just, you tell it where to render into. In this case, we have a div on the page called main, and that's where we're going to render our application. Now if we go look at history, we've got this as basically a global object. So you can import this history.js into any of your components, which is helpful when you want to transition between routes. And we'll look at some of the ways that we've done that upgrade here in just a minute. We've got this part right here where we're importing create hash history from history, and then we create and export a hash history. You can also create a browser history. If you do that, you're going to use the newer capabilities of the browser where you're actually changing the URLs without the hash. If we do hash history, then it'll put the little hash symbol and set the URLs after that. For now, for the applications that we're writing, it's more common that we're going to need to support some older browsers, so we've opted to use the hash history. Right. So in index.jsx, open up the old one, you can see that we used to have this route handler, and that's where the contents for the current route would be rendered. That is now replaced with this.props.children, so that's a fairly easy replacement to do. Go through your application, find your route handler entries, and then just change it out with this.props.children. There is one kind of gotcha, not really a gotcha, but let's see. If you need to pass other properties to the child, maybe you had a route handler and then you were passing some extra information. In React Router 1.0, you'll need to do React clone element, still give it the children, but then you'll add on those extra elements, and basically this makes it makes a clone of those children and then just tacks on the extra properties to make them available to the child components. Okay, so that one's not too bad. Transition to. So in our previous application, here's the old one, we had a bunch of places where we were calling transition to. So you can see we had to tell the component that we wanted access to the router on the context, and then you could call, where is it? Right there. We could call context.router, in the constructors can be context.router. Anywhere else it would be this.context.router. The router would attach itself to the global context, and then you could call methods on the router, and that would allow us to transition to a named route. And then if that named route, let's see if I can find an example here. Some of these require parameters. So the user's named route, let's just make this a little bigger. In this application, it's not in there. It's an admin routes. Right, routes admin. There we go. Okay, so this particular named route requires that you provide information about its parent. In this case, we have to provide an account ID. So in order to get to this route, it expects that parameter, and you can see that in this transition to right here. So in order to get to the named route users, I have to provide an account ID, and then the React router would figure out the correct path and take you there. That changes in the new router. It becomes push state, which I think actually extracted most of that from out of the new system. Okay, so I have to find an example of it. Sorry, just one second. In our new version, I've ripped out quite a bit of the old code because it wasn't used. Okay, so instead, let's just go write. Let's just take this one right here, and we'll just write the code. Okay, so this.context.router.transition to becomes history push state. Now, this thing you have to import. Remember back when we created that this history.js? We have to now import that guy. So if I'm actually editing the old app, but we'll just play along like we actually added the history in here. Oops. So you would import that history object. In this case, it's up a couple of directories. That, and now that history object is available to us. So rather than the router attaching itself to the global context, you explicitly import the history object so that you can then call push state. So we do that here. The first parameter is state, which I have yet to use. It's usually just a blank object. All right. Okay, so now I have to give it the actual path. And in this case, we're going to use the new string interpolation, which is going to be nice for building the path. That path is inside of here. So we can see off the root, it'll be /accounts with an ID and then users. Okay, so it would be accounts / an ID, and in this case that would come from this.props.account ID. You can see that right here. This is how we used to provide it, and then /users. So we're saying to the router now, hey, we need to move to this new state, and it will add that state transition there, and then we're good to go. It also keeps that in the browser history. If, however, you do not want the browser to record that history, you can instead call replace state. And that seems strange at first because you might ask yourself, why would I not want to record that in the browser history? I want the back button to work. And typically you do. However, there are times in our applications when we are essentially doing what is similar to a 302 redirect on the server. An example would be I'm reading a book. And so I transition to the book using push state, which might look something like books with this.props.params. You can still get URL values through properties. So this.props.params would give me like a book ID if that was what was in the URL. However, I transitioned to that point, and now the system doesn't know what to show. Whereas a user would typically expect to see the first page in the book, right? Like that's how you read a book. I get the book, I open it, I'm on the first page. So you might want to do a replace state where if there wasn't a this.props.page ID hanging around for some reason, this.props.params.page ID, then you might want to redirect to the first page. And then you could do something like this, where if this was, let's do this, that, make this a replace state, transition to the book, and maybe I have some, let's see, page, let's call this first page ID equals, the bookstore.get first page or something like that. There I have some method for getting the first page, and then maybe I have something like this, and I transition there. Okay, so now that I've done that, I don't actually want the back button to take me to the book, right? Like that was our first transition, and I would assume that this is going to be somewhere else. It's not we're not going to have this in all this code. This is just an example code. But this is going to live somewhere where I click to go open the book, and inside of the book component, then I check to see if we have a page ID. We don't, so we're going to take you to the first page. If I push the back button, I don't want to land on an empty book. I want to go back to the page I was originally on, because that's what the user experience is like. So that would be a justification for using replace state. All right, so then there are a couple other methods where you can test for which URL is active and so on and so forth. But anyway, are there any questions? Okay, I will link to the API docs. So like I say, if you need to, it's right here, API. If you need to determine which route is active, for example, I think that is in here. Let's see. I was just in these docs and now I can't find it. Right there, is active. So on the history object, you can say history.isActive and give it the path and any query, and it will return true or false to help you figure out if that path is active. We've run into that a couple of times where we need to maybe show some navigation or hide some navigation based on whether we're at a specific path. Again, this documentation is actually pretty good. The router documentation for 1.0 is much better than it has been in the past. So that's really great that the React Router team has been doing that. Okay, if there's no more questions, then that's all I have. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.